Hey everybody, this is Chris. Today I'm going to share with you in detail how to restore a large crosscut saw. It's come a long way from when I first started. Now the vast majority of this video is going to be dedicated to sharpening, but we're going to start with a simple restoration of the handles and the blade. I'm also excited to share that Josh Stevens, aka Mr. Chickadee on YouTube, a timber framing and hand tool expert, is going to be showing me how to sharpen this saw. Here we go. The first step is to assess the condition of the saw. The main handle and hardware are in pretty good shape. The secondary handle is toast. Everything is rusted together, it's broken. I'm going to have to remake this completely. I'll remove all the rust from the metal parts using Evapo-Rust. It'll sit overnight and that'll be good enough. I bent thin roof venting materials into a shallow pan to soak the saw. There's a lot of pitting in the saw, but the teeth look good. All the main handle needs is some sanding and oil. Now to remake the secondary handle, I'll fire up my foot-powered lathe and make a dowel. A little sawing, chiseling, and filing is all that's needed to attach the top cap. Then I'll use my bit and brace and different types of files to get a press fit. Now reassemble it and hit the road. To sharpen this saw, I'm going to go talk to a true expert. Josh Stevens is a hand tool and timber framing expert. In fact, he's built all the structures on his property using only hand tools. His YouTube channel is called Mr. Chickadee. It's a must-see. Josh, thank you very much for your help. I'm here in Kentucky at his place, doing a whole interview with him, so check that out on my channel. Subscribe to his channel, he's amazing. And right now we're gonna sharpen the saw. So Josh.
So Chris, we got a saw. There's a lot of different saws. We pick them up over at flea markets or whatever, and the first thing we want to look at is, well, what do we have? What kind of saw is it, and is it going to work for our purposes? This saw here that you've got is a perforated lance tooth pattern Here's another one. It's often called a champion tooth or American style. The difference is really not a lot. It's just that the saw you've got has 4 cutter teeth to 1 raker tooth. Well, what do I mean by that? The cutter teeth are these triangular pointed sharp teeth. The raker tooth is this Y shape. It looks like a capital letter Y. The cutters cut the wood and the raker removes the wood from the cut. It's as simple as that. Either of these will work for anything. Now back in the day, they would have marketed this type of saw specifically for hardwoods that has 2 cutters for each raker, and one like you've got here with the 4 cutters for a raker. They would have marketed mainly for softwoods, but I find that they both work interchangeably for everything if they're set up and sharpened correctly.
Okay.
So what to look for in a saw? Be careful of broken teeth, because that can indicate that your saw is too hard or brittle. You go to set the teeth, which is a little bit of a bend, and it could break. It also can indicate abuse in the past. So look for broken teeth. Look just to see how clean the saw is. Believe it or not, even bad pitting is not a no-go, because you can clean the metal of the tooth where it cuts the wood, and the rest doesn't actually matter, because it shouldn't even be engaging the wood at all because of the set, which we'll talk about in a second. Very simple process is really all we want to make sure is that we joint the saw, meaning that we hit with a file all the arc of that saw so that every tooth is the same height. And then we need to make sure, apart from shaping the teeth like this, we need to make sure that those raker teeth are set just a little bit shorter than the cutter teeth. Because if they're set too high, they're going to be trying to pull out wood that's not severed yet.
Okay.
And the saw won't be effective. Another thing we can do, we can go from our normal straight rakers like this to a swaged raker, which is, you can see, a little bit of a curve put on the edge of that to make it more efficient. Now, I've not seen tests between the two, but back in the day, the good saw filers all did these, so I say they wouldn't have done it for no reason at all. So we're going to see how to do all of this. All right, Chris, so there's several tools that you need. Some you don't, but some that are very important, some that you can probably make for the different processes. So we have to joint the saw with a file. You can just find an old mill file, mill bastard file or something like that. You can break off a section and you can get you one of these. You find these at estate sales or flea markets all the time. It's just a saw joiner. So it clamps the file. You can even tighten this and bend the file a little bit to keep an arc, or not, because it's only really going to contact a couple teeth at a time. It doesn't really matter that much. There's also a really nice and expensive tool called a long jointer. Gibbs made one of these. If you find an actual Gibbs, it's often $400 or $500. This one is a remake by the Crosscut saw company in New York. It's still about $100. It's nice. I wouldn't get it. It's not. I don't feel it's necessary for the size saws we've got over here. Now out west, when they had the big 7, 8, 12 foot long two-man saws, this made more sense, because what could happen is over time you can develop waves in the arc of the saw, and it's not a consistent arc. This long joiner was developed to prevent that. Here in eastern US, trees weren't that big, saws weren't that big. I find it's just not been necessary for me to use this.
Okay.
But this is what you need. And it doesn't have to be this. You could take a file and you could make a jig with a block of wood.
Got it.
You really just want to use this. You run it this way, and then you flip it around and run it this way to make sure you're getting consistency in joining the saw. And that's, I'll just do one pass to show you how easy it is. You just run like this, and then you come back. And you want to look at the little shiny spots. Tells you where you removed metal and where you didn't. And you want to do that until you got a shiny spot on every tooth. Now Now we can see on this saw, we hit a few teeth here, we missed a few, we hit a few, we missed a few. So this saw wasn't perfectly jointed in this application, but we would do that. And it probably would only take a few times to get a shiny point on each tooth. That's called jointing. That just makes sure everything is the same height. Why is that important, Chris? Well, the issue is, if we've got a log or a piece of wood we're cutting through, if the saw isn't jointed and some teeth are longer and some are shorter, well, they're not all engaging. And the saw's not going to cut efficiently.
Okay.
So we need all the teeth as much as possible to be engaging wood as much as they can. It also tells us the height of our raker teeth. So another tool that is very handy for our rakers is this. It's called a pin gauge. Okay. There's another one called a spider. Right, I guess it kind of looks like a spider or some bug. These you can also make, but you can buy them too. I think they're like $10 at the Crosscut company there. This is a good kind of hammer. It's fairly heavy, maybe 2, maybe 3 pounds, but it comes to a point. Can be used for setting teeth. You can also find these. This is a Stanley 43, which is the larger size saw set tool. I like these a lot. Again, you're going to see Warren Miller and people, they don't recommend these, but I think their larger saws were just not working so well with these smaller set tools. A chainsaw file is handy to get in these gullets and clean these out. You might not believe it, but I find that the cleanliness of this gullet helps the shaving a lot. If you've ever seen a diagram of how the shaving is produced, it's actually severed by the cutter tooth, and when the raker grabs it, it pulls the shaving right down through in there. And it rolls it up like a noodle. So I find that the first thing I often do with a new saw is get in here with the chainsaw file and just clean up, especially, this saw isn't that bad, but often you'll have rust, dirt, pitting down in there. You try to just brighten that up. As you sharpen your saw, it's going to get shorter too. So this is a point, eventually you're going to have to actually deepen these gullets. But if you just hit a few strokes each time you sharpen the saw, you won't have to spend hours on it someday. Okay. I've talked to a few Amish apprentices, and that's what they were done. Their job was to deepen the gullets, and they'd spend all day doing that. So you will need something like a mill file. This is actually a pretty large one. A 6-inch would be better. And a triangular file, like those used for hand saws. A 6-7 inch works really good for sharpening some of these things. We want to joint the saw until we get that bright spot on all the teeth. So if we've jointed this saw, we've got a flat, shiny spot on all the teeth and the rakers. The next step, if we're going to do swaged rakers, that I like to do, is to shape these rakers. I want to thin it out with a triangular file. We want to make it kind of thin so that when we hit it, it can bend without breaking. So we come in with a triangular file. And we take off some material. See how I'm thinning that out? Making it more easily bendable. It's important at this point, I don't want to remove that flat that I made while joining, because that's important for my depth. So I just try to look at the difference between these teeth, and you can see how this one is much thicker. And now I've thinned this out quite a bit. It only took a few strokes with the file. But we've gotten that thinned out. I've still got just a little bit of a flat. Now I'm going to go until that flat is nearly gone. Almost disappears. And I also want to clean the back side. So I've got clean metal, thin, almost taking the flat off right there. Now, the pin gauge is a little bit difficult to set up, but the idea is when we put this pin gauge spanning this gap, this little screw or bolt is sticking down is going to tell us, using a feeler gauge, that this is set a certain distance lower than these teeth.
And how do you know what that gap is, that distance?
Using our feeler gauge and using the Crosscut Saw Filer's Manual, which is a free PDF, we know that a good place to start is 12 thousandths of an inch. So to set that, we can put this gauge on a block of wood or flat straight edge, and if we loosen the pin, until it sits flat. So it's flat across and the pin is just touching the wood. And then we can adjust this nut so that our feeler gauge at 12 thousandths of an inch just fits between the nut and the base. And then we just remove this and tighten it. That's one way to do it. You could figure out another way whereby you take straight edges and a prayer and all this. But the point is you want to get that point, that distance, longer than either side.
Got it.
However you feel best to do that. And then you want to go down the saw and test that raker. So I can see that raker, it's touching the teeth. Now, the traditional way to do this was take your hammer and you strike that tooth carefully to bend it over, and you keep testing it with the pin gauge until when you hit and you test and it passes. It's as simple as that. It takes a little practice. Some people would also take, instead of actually hitting directly with a hammer, they would have something,
A small metal block, right?
where you could just use a piece of iron rod or something like this. So you hit this like that.
Got it.
So you're not... The real danger is if you miss this and you hit this cutter tooth, you could damage it.
Or if this has been over hardened, that will break, right?
Yes, and I have done that, and it is sad. It really hurts you in your heart when you break an entire section off here. If you do break one, it's not the end of the world because you got a whole bunch more. Just know that if you do start breaking teeth off, it might be a good idea to stop and take a propane torch and temper all the teeth to a blue.
Okay.
Because blue is a good temperature that should be soft enough you can file and bend stuff without it breaking, but still hard enough to hold an edge.
Got it. Okay.
If you can get by with it when you go shopping for a saw, just carry one of these in your pocket. When they're not looking, just test a tooth. See if you can bend it a little bit without it breaking. I've spent hours and hours sharpening saws, and because setting is often the last thing you do, you spend 3 hours on a saw and then you start crunching teeth off, and it's very disconcerting. So I would recommend before you start anything, try to set one tooth and see if it'll bend without breaking before you invest a lot of time into the saw. But that's how you would swage a raker. I mean, it's not that complicated. You joint the saw so you know that it's flat and the same height as your cutter teeth, and then you thin it out, and then you either strike it with a hammer or you use something else so it's easier to hit right there. And you just keep testing it until your pin just slides over it, or just touches it, basically. Now, the reason we did that before the cutter teeth is if your cutter teeth are razor sharp and you're doing all this, now you're running your gauge over them. You might be dulling them. You might be cutting your hand up. I just find it's easier to get these done before we go to the cutter teeth.
Okay.
Once we got the pin gauge and the rakers swaged and set to their right depths, we come over to the cutter teeth. Now for the cutter teeth, you can, with care, use just a triangle file. So if we look at this tooth, I'm going to let you get in close to this tooth here.
Which one? Yep.
So if we get into this tooth, we can see it's got a flat on the top. We want to sharpen either side of that tooth. That's how I would do it with a triangular file. If you've got a mill file, it's a little easier. This one's pretty dull, but you just do one side and then the other. And you want to sharpen up. Keep your eye on that shiny point that you jointed to. That's where you keep your eye on. And you work the bevels with your peripheral vision. A little easier for me with a triangular file. Now, this is a good shape for general purpose use. Traditionally, you would go with a finer, steeper point for softwoods and a shorter, blunter point angle for hardwoods, just because it's more durable. But this is a really good all-around shape. Again, I'm always going to keep saying the Crosscut Saw Filer's manual has all these angles with diagrams in it. Makes it really easy to understand. So I'm just going to work equally both bevel. I want to imagine, Chris, that my very last saw stroke would just barely remove the end of that flat.
Okay.
And you can take the end of your file that's just a flat piece and wipe off any burr from the back side of the tooth if you wish. Now this saw it's not all the way sharpened, but it's already getting quite sharp there. I've got just a little bit more to go, and I'll show you how a sharp tooth would feel. It helps sometimes to get some natural light to see those points, just like with a normal hand saw. Natural sunlight is the easiest way. See that tooth there? So that's how sharp all the teeth should be.
Without taking the height down.
Right. So that height should be exactly as it was with the joining process, because I was watching and I just took it down until that flat is just disappeared. You could even leave a tiny point of light there. It wouldn't hurt anything. And I often do. But that's how you would do each cutter tooth to that fineness of sharpness. And then you would set the saw. Now this is often the scariest part, because you could break a tooth. So you've got a couple options. You can either use a hammer. This is the most recommended method because it was found that the saw will hold the set the longest if it's been hammered in. It's also the easiest to break a tooth with a hammer or overset the tooth. It takes more skill. Let me grab another hammer here. Really, something like a 4-pound engineer's hammer would be ideal for this. There's also specialty hand anvils that people made and used for this. But the idea of the process is they would put the hand anvil, or in this case hammerhead, on the back side of the tooth. So this tooth here has the bevels facing towards me, so it needs to bend in that direction away from me. And I would put that there, and I would try to strike that tooth kind of on the point, just a little bit below the apex of where those bevels come together. Something like that. And then you have your spider gauge. You put Spider-Man on there and he sticks to the wall. And it's got 4 legs. And remember that feeler gauge we used before? Well, we would set that spider gauge so that when all 4 legs are placed down, we can just fit that in there. And that tells us how much set we're putting in the tooth.
Okay.
So, again, I find a really good place to start is 12,000th for the raker depth and for the set. And that can work really good for a lot of different kinds of woods. So we would, if we were using a hammer, we would strike the tooth and then we would test the tooth we struck with our spider gauge like this to see if it just touched there. That takes a lot of practice. It's probably the best way to do it, and if you're a professional saw filer, you'd use that. This tool here, this is the Stanley number 43. There was other makes out there, but this is a large saw setting tool, and it's very easy to adjust here how much set you're putting into the saw, and it just goes over the tooth, and I hope I don't break this tooth. You just bend by squeezing. Okay. So that's a lot easier, and you get a consistent bend with each tooth. You just put the little anvil. You want to get a close-up from up to down, showing what's happening there? So if I was going to set this tooth with this tool, I would place it down here. It's got an anvil and a plunger, and the plunger just pinches that tooth against the anvil and bends it ever so slightly. And that's it.
Got it.
So I would do every tooth pointed away from me, and then I would come back in the other direction and do the teeth going the opposite way. I guess I should mention why we're putting set in the saw in the first place. If our saw is going to cut, and we imagine these teeth are making a kerf or a cut in the wood the same thickness as the steel, it will go so far and then get stuck. When we set the teeth, we bend the teeth every other way, like so, like my fingers are indicating. And what that does is it makes the saw cut a kerf that's wider than the actual body and plate of the saw, so it doesn't get stuck.
And is there different kerfs for different types of wood?
Yes, well, there's more or less set. So more set would give you a wider kerf, and you'd want to use more set for something like punky soft wood. If you
like
had
pine and with all the sap, or
pine, or maybe tulip poplar that was really green and fresh. If you had something like oak or hickory or dry wood, then you would want less set because you can get away with thinner kerf.
Yeah.
You always want to use the least amount of set you can get away with because it's less work, it's less wood you're removing.
Now, back in the day, they'd always carry a bottle of kerosene with them, right? And that would be to take the sap off. Would that be another way to...
Often they did. They took... that's more about preventing the sap in coniferous trees from gumming up the saw than actually helping with the set.
Got it. Okay.
The set should open up the kerf for your saw to pass. If you're into some really sappy wood, you might want to have, even olive oil or diesel or anything will help free that up. I've cut a lot of pine here locally, and I guess it's not the same as some of the tamarack and stuff they had out west that was just really sappy, because I've never had a problem with sap actually gumming a saw.
Okay.
But the set is very important. The least amount you can get away with. I would always start with less. And if you're cutting hardwoods, you might get away with 0.08 of an inch of set, which is almost nothing. And it also, I should mention that the older saws were often taper ground, so that the back was much thinner than the tooth line. And you can look at a saw at an antique store, look at the teeth, and just think about how thick that is, and then flip it over and look at the spine and see how thick that is. And often they were drastically tapered, and that means that you can get away with even less set. I don't know of any new saws being made that are tapered crown like the old ones. So we joint the saw, we swage the rakers to the right height, we file up the cutter teeth, and then we set them. And that's about it.
As we go about sharpening the rest of the saw, I've captured some of Josh's tips and tricks. All the way up?
Yeah, just like with a rolling, mostly the bottom, and then your saw, if it's not real dirty, it's not the biggest deal. Mostly just get the pitting loose. Just try to hit, in line with the teeth.
Good.
Awesome.
Wow. It worked. Okay.
Awesome. One thing that's very beneficial is to be able to tilt it, say 45 degrees, so you just file.
Oh, yeah.
You want to angle like this. And then the other side like that.
Got it.
So up here, you're going to have a really hard time. You're going to come down at this angle. This is where being able to tilt this helps. So you get an angle like that, and then the opposite angle is like this. These here you did look so much better than your first one, so you're progressing a lot.
Thank you.
Definitely, look at that. That's great. Go there. So, now, we'll just have to flip it around. So you pull out if you look at your noodles, imagine you have this noodle of wood like pasta, and the edges are fuzzy, then that means that the fibers haven't been fully severed by the cutter teeth before they were pulled out. So essentially your raker is too long. It needs to be shortened some, so that gives more of a chance for the cutter teeth to fully sever the fibers before they're pulled out. Now that we've swaged the rakers, pointed up the cutters, they're all bright, shiny, and beautiful. We need to make sure we got proper set. We can use a tool like this, as we showed earlier, squeezing the tooth, and we can actually use our spider that we set with a feeler gauge to see, do we need to adjust this to give us more or less set. Or you can use the hammer, which takes a little more practice. This saw, just probably from the factory, already had quite a bit of set in it. As I'm checking this, I've got my spider set to 12 thousandths of an inch, and I'm touching teeth, so I wouldn't add more set. What I will do is look for some teeth that maybe don't have enough or have less, because maybe some of them got filed down more than others, like this tooth here, and I'm going to add a little bit of set to it. Just like that. So now that tooth, that tooth. So part of this saw obviously got filed a little more than others in the straightening and joining process, and those parts needed a little bit more set. So that side is done. Let me just flip it over. So that's an example of what can happen when our teeth get brittle. That one didn't come off, but it snapped.
Yep, I could hear it.
And it could have been that there was stress in that tooth already from the past. It maybe got dropped.
I would never drop it.
Somebody before Chris maybe dropped it. Or it might have just been an imperfect tempering job at the factory, which that happened a lot too. I always try to sit as carefully as I can. Squeeze a little, let go, squeeze a little bit more. And if you're cutting dry or hard wood, you may not even need to worry about setting the saw every time you sharpen it. If you're just taking off a little bit of material. I wouldn't even worry about setting it again until it starts to bind.
Okay.
If you notice you're getting binding, then obviously you don't have enough set. But as it is now, I think it's ready to rock.
All right.
You want to cut some wood?
Yeah, let's cut some wood.
All right. So if we look at the noodle, we see that it's cleanly cut on the sides, left and right. That's the indicator we've got a good set on our raker. With a larger diameter log and a softer wood, you'll get longer noodles. It often takes a little bit of a thickness in the log to develop good ones. But that's cutting very cleanly and ejecting the frass just perfectly.
It's time to test the saw on a slightly larger log. It cuts amazing. Woo! Now, how do I get this out of here? Please subscribe to me on YouTube and follow me on Instagram or Twitter @ChopWithChris so you don't miss out on any of my future projects. And finally, thank you to Josh Stevens. Be sure to follow him on YouTube at Mr. Chickadee. Thank you.